Hey everyone, this video is inspired by a very short clip. I think it's actually an old clip of a conversation between Aaron Mate and Dave Smith. And at one point in the conversation, Aaron asked Dave, "Hey, we agree so much on Gaza and on Israel and Zionism," and Aaron goes on to, speak very admiringly of the likes of Scott Horton. He says, "Hey, these libertarians have been." I mean, he described his opinions in foreign policy and being, quote, in a lockstep with the libertarians. And then, and he qualified this and said, I don't want this to be an argument, but what's the deal with the libertarians being against welfare? I mean, he seems so reasonable and logical on all this stuff in foreign policy. Then why are you so antithetical? And it's clear that he just does not understand why the libertarians aren't, for welfare, however defined, if that's universal health care, whatever the case may be. And to his, credit, Dave kind of responded also, hey, I don't want there to be a fight, and kind of gave his answer. But he gave an answer kind of in terms of like prioritizing, like, I'd rather cut spending that's for the war than there is for welfare. So even if I don't like welfare, I want to prioritize the war. Fair enough. But I think this is kind of interesting. This war in Gaza, or and to call it a war is maybe giving too much credence to what the Israelis are doing. It has been interesting because I've seen so many, people on the left that I've for so long just considered, you know, stupid, brutes, idiots, no, it's people that I disagreed with all the time, suddenly, saying stuff that I agree with when it comes to Israel-Palestine. Classic example would be Cenk Younger. I've always thought of him as just an idiot, just a horrible, the Young Turks are just wrong about everything, and also the same can be also said for Anna Kasparian. And yet, when they talk about Israel Palestine, I think that they're mostly correct, and they can speak in a way they're like, yeah, I understand that they're actually applying a certain degree of rigor here, and a certain degree of understanding that I can appreciate. And there's even a debate where Dave Smith and Cenk Younger are debating together on the same team. And I mean, this isn't a totally new phenomenon. I mean, I read Goliath by Max Blumenthal, I think 11 years ago, based on the recommendations of Scott Horton. And Scott Horton has been interviewing Max Blumenthal for at least that long, but probably 20 years at this point, 15 or 20 years. But because of the war, it's become much, much, much more common. And so many libertarians are good on the foreign policy issues. They're not all. I mean, there are some libertarians whose Jewish Zionism kind of taints it a little bit, but they're relatively rare. I mean, so we have the Walter Blocks of the world, but most libertarians are going to be pretty strong, non-interventionists, and pretty strongly against the war and what Israel's doing. And many are going to be even anti-Zionists for a host of libertarian reasons. I mean, I had this this conversation with a Jewish friend from the UK once, and I'm like, I'm an anarchist, so how am I going to feel about an ideology that's kind of based and centered on having a certain type of state, whether it be for Jews or Uyghurs or even Americans? This is not going to be a philosophy that I find super, super great. It's a variant of nationalism that's at best going to be ugly. But I think it's fair to say that, and it's good, and I think both of them approach this well. You don't have to agree with everything to have allies. A really great kind of thing to harken back to is the abolitionist movement. Abolitionists disagreed on many, many different things, and there are many other. Most of them, because they were taken, especially early on in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, if you were being anti-slavery, you probably had other heterodox beliefs. You might have been also for feminism. Now, not all the abolitionists were feminists. In fact, I think Frederick Douglass was not a feminist. He didn't believe that women should have the right to vote. Could get that wrong, but some of them did, some of them didn't. And although they were prone to maybe squabbling about it, I think most of them had the wisdom to go, look, we can have that debate later or in a different context, but if we want to fight slavery, if we want to end slavery, if we want to abolish slavery, then when we're talking about slavery, we just need to present a united front. And you don't want to bring all this other baggage in. If you're trying to persuade a non-abolitionist to become an abolitionist, even if you feel equally strongly about your feminism or your women's liberation or however you might feel about the Native Americans or all these theological beliefs, Trinitarianism, Unitarianism, stuff that today doesn't seem to have that much relevance, but back then would have been a really big deal. Baptists and Anabaptists. You kind of understand you don't want to bring that in, because if you want to persuade them on the one, you shouldn't make it contingent on persuading them on all the rest. And then you can open up yourself to allies, and once slavery is abolished, then you all can have your disagreements about women voting, or what day of the Sabbath it should be, or whatever the case may be. And so I think it's perfectly valid to just acknowledge, if you feel really strongly on an issue and someone else feels strongly on that issue, that you guys can work together even if you disagree on any number, even all other issues. So, if I see someone from the Young Turks speaking wisely about Israel, I mean, I even see people on Pod Save America now speaking wisely about Israel, finally, right? Are they, whatever, I mean, I could think of all the things I could say about Obama that they would not recognize probably. But okay, we can talk about that when we have a debate about Obama, but we don't have to talk about that when we're having a debate about whether the U.S. should continue to fund Israel-Palestine. So I think that's totally valid and totally fair, and to the benefit of everyone, to just, hey, we can acknowledge if there's a disagreement, but like if we're coming together on this or some other issue, then that's where you put it. And you don't sweep it under the rug. You just say, hey, for now we're talking about this. But to kind of answer the question, I feel that most people, liberals, progressives, most of the people who favor welfare, the way that they talk about it, the way they reference it, the way that they seem to relate to it, is kind of similar to the Zionists in the sense that they have just a lot of myth making. So, the Zionists have this whole mythology, that's make believe. I mean, they believe that there was a unified unified Israel state in the time of Solomon and David, and there is zero historical or archaeological evidence to suggest that. And they also have these sayings that still some believe today, or maybe it's been debunked, but when they first became Zionists, they believed that the Jews were a people without a land, and Palestine was a land without a people. There was nobody there, and then the Jews wanted it. And so in this conception, Zionism is just totally, there's nothing to object about it, because nobody's getting harmed. In fact, the Jews are getting what they want. There's nobody there who's being dispossessed. And now this previously unused vacant land is now made to bloom. The desert blooms, and to the extent they now have commercial interests with everyone else, they're benefiting, because you can buy, sun-dried tomatoes from Israel that wouldn't exist there otherwise, thanks to the Jews, right? But of course, this is a myth, and people who persist in talking about it that way and thinking about it that way and couching Zionism in that way, they're wrong, and they're delusional, and there's a cost to that delusion, right? They now are putting themselves in a position where they're causing real harm on the basis of a faulty premise. And I think that when I hear people who favor welfare talk about it, I do not get the impression that they really know what that entails. When people who favor welfare talk about whether it's universal health care or WIC or public schools or anything, the impression that I get when they talk about it is that welfare is just a free gift from the government. The government has a massive quantity of resources and wealth that it just has, that just came into existence, that just is just a de facto fact, and then it's distributing it to people to their sole benefit, and that there is no cost to this to anyone. And if that's what welfare was, I would also have no objection to it. There would be no problem, and a libertarian, whatever, would be just as, but the fact is, that's not how welfare works. That wealth, whether it comes in fiduciary monetary form or physical goods or however, has to be created by someone. And it's not created by the government. It's created by people who are then have their wealth expropriated or taxed or surreptitiously taxed through inflation, right? And so right from the get-go, it is not, you're not just giving a gift. You are taking and then giving. And also, just practically speaking, if you make, $1,000 in a week, and $100 gets taken out of your paycheck to go to, let's just say the government, aggregate it together. That does not mean that $100 then, goes into the bank account of some destitute single mother who can't afford. It's going to go to government bureaucrats. It's going to go to social workers and to their holiday pay and to the air conditioning and to the janitors in their new building that they built and to their pensions, which are going to be very generous and very large. And, maybe if you're lucky, $10 of that 100 that you were taxed is actually manifesting as a physical good. And even then, it comes with all this moral hazard. Who is it going to? Who deserves it? So they're not talking about it like that. They either think it's a free gift or that it's just coming from the rich, that we're just going to tax rich people, and so it's a gift from the rich to the poor. Just ethically speaking, there is no such thing as forced philanthropy, right? If you ask somebody for a donation and they give you a donation, or you ask for charity and they give you charity, that's philanthropy. That's charity. That's a voluntary show of people saying, I value enough that I'm going to give you something without an expectation of a reward. But that is not how governments work. That's not the basis of how they function. They demand and then they threaten, and this is what, people think that this is hyperbolic, but it is true that, like, if you refuse and there's any kind of ordinance with a penalty, they're going to come and they're going to take it. And so it is totally different to solicit a charity or to give freely of your own than is to give freely of others, right? That's the weird thing, is these progressives and these liberals talk about they're a good person because they're demanding that the state give to somebody else. That is not what they're doing. Now, again, I think that they often conceptualize this as we're going to take from the rich and give to the poor. Very Robin Hood of them. First of all, it's not clear that that's any better, that the rich are somehow so ethically abhorrent that they can be expropriated. And there is also a huge incentive that even if they are abhorrent, if you are going to do that, they have no incentive to become rich in the first place. If you're just going to say, a 90% tax on everybody over $1 million, then what's the point of ever earning more than $1 million? Why should you build a business? Why should you work hard? Why should you do anything if the government's just going to take almost all of it away? Then there's really not an incentive to do that. And this is borne out. Places with really high marginal tax rates, or where you can be expropriated. If you have kleptocratic states that will just take, there's no reason for anyone to do that, ethics aside, even if you don't care. So when they talk about it, it's not clear that they seem to have huge ethical confusion on it. The other thing is that you can have progressive taxation and you can say, oh, we're just going to tax the rich. It never works out that way. They find a way to pass it down the chain of production, and all taxes fall onto consumers ultimately, and the people who are the poorest are the ones where they actually are going to hit the most. It is true that you could tax, if you tax a millionaire who has multiple homes 50%, yes, that's going to hurt. In fact, they're going to pay more in total dollar amounts, but then that also just means, well, they won't go to Europe. Maybe they don't have a second home. Maybe they get rid of a yacht, whatever. But then down the line, you have middle class people who was like, now I can't afford my mortgage. I can't afford a home. I can't get a second car, so we only have the one. I can't send my kid to college. I can't do this. And then you get to poor people where it's, I can't afford food. I can't afford medicine. I have to work 3 jobs just to pay my rent. What's the point? If landlords are going to be rich and we're going to tax them more, then they're going to have to take that more out of their renters or just stop renting, right? So they seem to make it. And then there's a whole host of other moral hazard that comes with this that when people advocate it so flippantly, it's not clear to me that they've even thought about this. So a huge amount of the poverty, poverty has many reasons, and there's in the 19th century they had this conception of the worthy poor and I guess, for lack of a better term, the unworthy poor. There are people who, through no fault of their own, are just very, very unlucky. Something terrible happened. They They developed a disease that they couldn't have avoided, or some calamity happens, and they are now just some level incapable of providing for themselves. Maybe completely, maybe they even need to be heavily subsidized just to even be alive, although that would be rare. It does happen. But then there's also a lot of people where this isn't really true. Like they're making decisions that are not being forced on them, that kind of have clear consequences. And are we then, if we're just going to give, I mean, it's the idea that welfare is just granted a certain amount and no questions asked, or is it like, are we trying to make them equal in some sense? Like we're going to keep paying them until they become middle class or whatever. And it's clear that a huge part of the homeless population are just super addicted to drugs or have all kinds of serious mental illnesses, or just choose to be that way. I've known people who have just chosen to become homeless, people who had good careers and who had skills that were worth a lot of money, and just decided, I don't want to deal with this anymore. I'd rather just be a bum. I would rather live under a bridge and just be drunk all the time and do drugs all the time, even if they're not doing that for a long time. And I'm thinking of one person in particular. They even inherited money on 2 different occasions in like large amounts. They inherited $250,000 once, and $65,000 the second time. The second time, I knew them really, really well. They actually lived with me. They wanted to move here and kind of start over, and they managed to spend $65,000 in inherited wealth in the course of 3 months. And like, what are you spending that money on to spend it that much? And literally, that could have been a down payment on a house. That could have even just been a house. That could have been whatever. And it's just gone. So what's the idea then? But if there was a government program just giving them a check, what, forever? And we're just uncritically supposed to just acknowledge that? And of course, for every $100 they get in a check, that's $200 for the administrative friction of the government running that program, and the bureaucrats who will never lose their job, who will always get raises, that will always have time off, that will always have matching funds into their 401k, and who basically can never be fired for any reason at all, right? And there's also just this incentive. Then why bother working? So people who just have bad luck, who are put into a bad position, maybe the business closes, they have an illness where they have to stop working for a few months or whatever. And they did all kinds of studies about this when the welfare programs were first starting. There's a certain, 5-10% of the people on welfare who are go-getters and will find a way. But those people will find a way even if they didn't get the welfare. The welfare helps them, but they probably would have, by hook or by crook, found a way anyway. For everybody else, they'll take the welfare and they'll spend the welfare, but it's not actually going to make their lives better. They're just going to stay in an indigent position. And maybe some people are going to be that way, but if that's the case, I don't think that you can just take it for granted that their neighbors who have families to feed and their own goals and their own ideas, that they simply have to support it forever and ever and ever unquestionably. And the incentives then you create is fewer people do that. The other thing is there's kind of tied into this, and I'll say it just very briefly. They seem to think about things, I mean, they seem to think it's like a right, but that's nice to say, but then what does that actually mean? So like if you have, say, a right to health care, does that mean that if I want to go onto steroids because my goal has always been to bodybuilder, that I should be given steroids? And then all the medical treatments to take care of me as my liver fails, right? Does that mean that I should be given a gym membership? Does that mean if I want to be an Olympic swimmer, even though I'm not very good, but I just want to be that, should I be given access to a pool? Should I be given access to a dietitian? Should I be given access to this, right? Every yes, there's some medical things that almost everyone's going to agree with, but there's also a huge number that are marginal. They're like, do I need it? Do I really need it? Do I need to run a test? Like I have gone to dermatologists a couple times to have like moles removed. All right. I don't, sometimes I've had them like, oh, this is a little raised. It annoys me. I want to get rid of it. Every time I go, they say, we have to, and I'm paying out of pocket. I don't have insurance. But I come like, I have money. I will pay you money. And they'll say, okay, but we have to send it in as a biopsy to be tested for cancer. And I said, well, does it look like it's cancer? And like, no, it doesn't look like there's any cancer there. It's just a totally normal mole. And I'm like, okay, so I don't want to pay to have it be tested for cancer. Like, you don't think there's cancer? I don't think there's cancer. Why am I going to pay $200 or $150 or whatever? Just don't do it. It's not a service that I want. And they will argue and argue and argue just to put it on the bill, right? So, but there's so many things like that. If you're going to get, I'm gay, a lot of gay guys get STD tested. Do you want to get STD tested once a year or twice a year or 5 times a year? And like, you can make that argument. Or even, I mean, people hate to talk about it, but like, I have one grandma who's still alive. She's 105. She lives on her own. She takes care of herself. She's got her wits about her. My other grandmother died when she was 83. And her health declined a lot. And like by the time she got to her 80s, she wasn't doing really good, physically anyway. And she'd been a widow for 30 years at that point, maybe more actually. And it got to the point where like all of her children were adults, her grandchildren were adults, her grandchildren were starting to get married. She was about to become a great grandmother. And she just, she started to wither. And then her children didn't want her to die. Obviously they love her. And so they started having her get these, I guess it was plasma infusions. Like they were giving her plasma, and every time they'd give her plasma, she would improve a little bit, but then she would need more plasma, a week later or 2 weeks later or whatever. And eventually she didn't really ever get better, and she didn't even show any kind of desire to try and get better. Like if they said, well, here, you need to eat a really strict diet and you have to go to therapy and you have to do all these things. And she was just like, I don't feel like it, And so eventually, after I don't remember how long, they decided, we'll just stop giving her plasma. And then, very quickly she deteriorated and she died. And I remember one of her kids, one of my uncles, telling me about a year later, he goes, I don't know that we made the right decision there. Why did we keep giving her plasma when it just prolonged her suffering? And it wasn't like she was living for a particular thing, like she wanted to see her child get married or her grandchild finish college. It was like she didn't see much of a reason, but they could have kept doing that. And what's weird is like, it's funny that within the family we could have this debate. Well, should we keep giving her plasma? But are these liberals, these progressives, are they just think this is a stupid argument and that she should just automatically get whatever she wants all the time? And even if our family could disagree on whether she should have plasma or not, that actually the state will say she always gets plasma, and everyone else in and that's the problem. This is where the whole death boards come from, and people hate them, but it just makes sense. It suddenly becomes everybody's health becomes everybody else's business. I mean, it just becomes politics. It doesn't become a family decision about family values and interpersonal relationships between the healthcare provider and everyone else. It becomes a political decision for everyone. If we're going to have universal healthcare, for instance, or not even that, if we're just going to a universal right that the state has to pay for, even if it's not administered by an NHS, like Medicaid for all, then we are going to have discussions like, can you wear a helmet should we even allow people to motorcycle, right? Because they will get into more accidents, and when they do, it will be more costly. So maybe it's not just your body, your choice, the mantra that they would say in everything other than COVID. It becomes a political thing. And really that's an illustrative example, but it's everything at that point. I mean, forget smoking, forget drugs. I mean, yes, all that stuff too. But even, I like to hike. I watch a lot of hiking videos, and some of these people are out hiking or doing alpinism. They risk getting hurt. They risk needing to be rescued. And in a society where it's their right to have that provided by the state, by welfare, I mean, that's super expensive. It seems cool, like, well, they're out there having the time of their lives, enjoying nature, but there's just a statistical probability that they will at some point need medical care. And if it's and many of these people are in Canada, so this isn't even hypothetical, it becomes a burden, something that the rest of society has to pay for. And so then we have to ask, it suddenly becomes a political question, and it's very easy to act all philanthropic. Like, I'm just giving it away, but are you forever? Are we going to, like, could my grandma still be on plasma, 20 years after she would have died of natural causes? Right? Or like, I'm gay. A lot of gay guys are on PrEP. PrEP costs about $20,000 a year, and it protects them from getting HIV. And, like, that's wonderful. But why should people who aren't gay and who are at a very, very low risk of HIV, why should they have to subsidize, what is essentially helping in the sexual proclivities of gay men? Like, or other gay men who are not doing that, right? Like, not all gay men are promiscuous, and not all gay men need to be on PrEP. Like, and it's just, the list is endless. It's like every single thing. And of course, the big killers like heart disease. Now we are talking about, are we banning sugar? Are we going to ban, fast food? Are we going to regulate ways you can eat? Are we going to mandate or not mandate that you do or don't go to the gym? And these questions are not like random what ifs. They instantly become topics that have to be worked out. Like, they now become an issue that can't be based on individual rights. They can't be based on individual preferences. So, like, if you're not into alpinism and you don't like to hike mountains, then that's fine, and you shouldn't have to, and you also shouldn't have to subsidize the people who do, right? If you want to have a lot of sex with a lot of gay men and risk getting HIV, you should be totally free to do that. I have no problem with that, obviously, but you should not then insist that other people subsidize you doing that. They should not, you can pay for your own health care, take your own chances, or if you can't pay for the PrEP, pay for the condoms. They're much, much, much cheaper and probably more effective. Okay, so, like, and again, that this is multiplied like more than a millionfold. And so, yes, but when I hear liberals talk about welfare, I do not get the impression that they understand any of this, that they think about any of this. And if they talk about, well, what about the poor? What about the people who truly can't? The same thing about schools. What about, everyone knows rich people can afford to send their kids to whatever private school. Everyone knows that middle class people can afford send their kids to private school, or to at least homeschool them. And if they don't know this, but if they were to look into it, they would also know that poor people who value education can homeschool their kids or find ways to send them to charter schools or whatever. And that there's really only a very small sliver of people who are poor and whose families don't care about education that are unlikely to get any without the state mandating it. And of course, those are the people who that mandate is going to do the least for. If you have a person whose family culturally or for whatever reason doesn't value education at all, the chances that they value education at all are very low, and that they're going to be able to take any meaningful advantage of that education is also very similar to the welfare problem. But the other kind of bait and switch here, though, is like, even if you want to justify a system for those people, and, and anecdotally, there's some of those people will benefit from it for sure. That's an argument for a welfare school for indigent people. That's not an argument for universal education for everyone, because most people don't need it. And it is the same thing for welfare. We make an argument, hey, what if, many, many medical services are fungible, right? A gay guy could decide not to go onto PrEP. Somebody could decide not to have a biopsy done. Somebody could have less blood work than they possibly could, or whatever. But then there are cases where anyone who would want to, but again, it's hard. Like, a lot of elderly people will just decide, I don't want to get treated for cancer because I'm already really old. Why not let them make that decision? But of course, in the where it becomes a politicized right, then actually they can't make that decision, even if they want to. They could say, I do want to live, and the state could be like, you don't pay taxes anymore, and so you go on to the Liverpool care pathway, and we're just going to put you on drugs until you're dead. And then we'll lie to your family and say we did all we could. But that's necessarily what's going to happen. But then you have certain cases. Let's say you are healthy and presumably you'd want to live, but you have a horrible heart attack and you're unconscious. Does somebody give you medical care or not? And let's say, oh, well, you do. Okay. But and I could totally see a free market. I mean, the other thing is in a free market, there'd be no regulation and healthcare costs would be much, much, much lower. And then people would have higher disposable incomes. So there'd be more charity, which doesn't mean everybody would get whatever they need all the time, which is not even true in the universal healthcare situation. But more people could get what they want and what they ask for and what they can afford. And there would be innovation and it would get better and better and better. Just like we don't have programs to give poor people smartphones or flat screen TVs because those things have become affordable and attainable, even though they're complex technologies that require massive, chains of commerce and infrastructure to produce and to disseminate and to, populate with content. And yet no one has our food, like what it takes to have food be available to everyone. And yet it is, and it's obscenely cheap for the most part. I mean, it's gone up now because of inflation, but that's to a very large extent because of the policies of the universalists. Let's just give welfare to everyone. I mean, the military spending is out of control and terrible and unbelievably wasteful. But the social welfare programs are the lion's share of the federal budget. And at the local budget, I mean, things like schools are usually the lion's share of the budget. A huge part of your property taxes are to pay for the pensions of the people who are teaching the stuff that your kids don't remember or care about. It's great for them. It's unclear that it is of much benefit to anyone else and that it maybe couldn't be done in a different way and for far less and without raising the ethical questions that it currently does, or without making it become a political. This is why a debate about evolution in school, for example, is even necessary, because we're all paying for it. So like even the creationists pay their taxes and have truancy laws that compel them to send their kids somewhere. And we've got to the point now where a lot of liberals don't like it when they continue to pay, but then just decide to home educate, even though statistically their pedagogy is much better in terms of cost, way better. But now we have to have that debate though, because we're all paying for it and it's public, and so it has to somehow. And this is another just general problem with progressives where they are very, very pie in the sky, is they have whatever personal things they have and then they just project that onto the government and think that's what it's going to do and what it can do, and taking no account of the fact that, look, the state is not your private fief that's going to do whatever you want. And if you treat it that way, you're going to have all kinds of problems because people are going to fight you about all the stuff that you take for granted that is just obvious to you, but not everybody else. Right, just as it's obvious to the Zionists that Israel belongs to the Jews because what the Bible says. Okay, well, it's not obvious to everybody else that makes any sense whatsoever. You want to do your personal aliyah and go there and run an apartment from whoever, go for it. You want to teach your kids Hebrew? Awesome, go for it. You want to bulldoze all your neighbors and kill them all because no, that's not okay. When I listen to these, whether they Marxists, whether they liberals, whether they're progressives, whatever, I never get any sense that they have any appreciation of what they're even talking about. They just have this rose-colored panacea in mind that the government just creates prosperity and just gives it to people. And it's the horrible misers of the world who are just stopping it from distributing, this wealth. Now, if you're a utilitarian, you could still argue, well, maybe it's good that these things on net, it's better to have this welfare program or not this welfare program. But as soon as you start casting the debate in terms of understanding that there's opportunity costs, that there's incentive problems, that there's moral hazard, that there are ethical questions that are just kind of glossed over completely, then all of a sudden it doesn't sound so, because it doesn't sound like such a no-brainer. They kind of couch it like you must be some kind of crazy alien that you don't favor a government control over all the healthcare, or automatic welfare without question for everyone forever. And no, I mean, if you actually think about it, there's good reasons to question that. And the fact that you aren't doing that indicates that there is some heavy, heavy bias reasoning going on, that you are not looking at this logically, that you're not looking at this empirically, that you have a bunch of assumptions that you're just baking into the premise and then getting confused why other people who you otherwise respect don't agree. So I think it's good that, look, the war in Gaza is terrible. Zionism is a horrible ideology. It's It's just such an abomination. It's not Western. It's not even Jewish. I mean, if you listen to the real hardcore Judophiles, they don't like Zionism either. Many of them, they think it's like the anti-Jewishness. If you listen to people like David Shapiro and others like, and it's the same thing with the welfare. It sounds great until you look at it with any kind of critical eye, any kind of empiricism, any kind of understanding of history, and all of a sudden it becomes, this is not clearly, obviously the right thing to do. Again, you might make an argument that pragmatically in certain situations, okay, maybe that's the best we can do in some limited scenario, but this huge, I mean, again, to go from like the old woman who needs to be on dialysis by no fault of her own or she'll die tomorrow to everybody gets COVID shots forever, and everyone gets automatically rescued whenever they get themselves into stupid problems or because they're racing down the road. Somebody who's speeding down the road 100 miles an hour and they hit a telephone pole and now they need surgery. Why is that on everyone else to pay for? And isn't it the fact that they are and that they know that they'll be covered kind of a huge moral hazard? Is it not? I mean, the Obamacare used to run these ads like targeting gay people, but really also targeting just progressives, showing these cute twinks, and you can find the commercial. They're like dressed up. It's like Christmas, and they're just like, hey, do whatever you want because you're covered. And again, you should be able to do whatever you want. You should be able to you should be able to smoke. You should be able to do drugs. You should be able to take risks. If you want to go hiking, if you want to go mountain climbing, you want to go base jumping or bungee jumping or skydiving, you should be able to do all that. You want to have promiscuous sex, you should be able to do that. But then you shouldn't say others are obligated to subsidize those behaviors. You shouldn't say that when the bill comes due that you can suddenly believe in socialism and say, oh, everyone else has to pay for this. And the people who are being asked to pay have every right to question why. And if you don't want that question, if you don't want there to be this committee of decisions on every minutia of every single decision, then you cannot have it be a public good like that. You just can't. I mean, if you say we're not going to have that, then it's just going to be vast amounts of waste and moral hazard. So, yeah, I'm glad that there's some mutually respectful dialogue going on. I'll say that I have found respect for people like Anna Kasparian and Cenk Unger, and I didn't really know Mate much or Max Blumenthal that I didn't have before, and that I wouldn't have had outside of this context, and that's wonderful. And maybe we can have a discussion about left, right, welfare, not welfare, and maybe the mutual respect we have over agreeing over what's happening in Gaza or with Zionism generally. That's great, but yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. I think it is a really interesting what's going on now. I think Israel is losing all. This is another topic, but I've never seen it like this. It's Hezbollah is completely failing, and the fact that it was very obvious for anyone who paid attention that it was, if not genocidal, and genocidal is a loaded legal term that's maybe not very useful in this, but a mass murdering Jewish supremacist fascist ideology. So it's those things, even if it's not genocidal. It's very clear now. So anyway, I know it's been a while since I did a video. I hope you're all doing well, and have a great day.